So mountaintop experiences are kind of interesting. In 2005, the first church I was pastoring at, I was an associate pastor. It was a large church, and one of the first tasks that I was given was to kind of run. I kind of did a bunch of random stuff. There was several pastors on staff, and they asked me to run a big event. It was open to the community. It was inviting other churches and pastors in the area, and we really didn't know what to expect. We were thinking maybe 800 people would show up, and we just didn't know. And I was young, and I'm still young, but yeah. So but I was very young at the time, 25, I think, 25. And there was actually some murmuring among the staff because I was brand new and I had been put in charge of this rather large event. And so a lot of people were kind of, they weren't mean, but they just thought, well, can you handle this? Is this going to work out? Is this going to go well? And it ended up being, a good fit for my gifting, and I ended up taking it and running with it. And the event happened, and in some ways I felt vindicated. We had a really large turnout. Everything went really well. It was one of those things where just like, you're all done and you were like, hey, this is awesome, praise God. You're like everything went great. And for me at that moment, it was kind of like, this little mountaintop experience where I was like, oh, wow, this all turned out really good. I'm doing really good. God's doing great. Everything's awesome. And I did not expect that the next week was probably one of the lowest points that I had ever experienced in my short term as being in ministry. Because if you think about a mountaintop experience, you get to the top, there's nowhere to go but down, right? And I was young, I hadn't recognized that, and I thought, I'm going to get up there and I'm just going to keep going. It's just going to be always great all the time, right? And I didn't realize that oftentimes after a really big, awesome experience like that, just human nature, adrenaline's going, you're really engaged, you're pumping, everything's working and going, and everything's going great, and then you get to the point and it's like, now is the time to kind of be done with that event and to rest. And sometimes that can be really, really difficult because you're kind of on this mountaintop high, and then everything just comes down and you think, well, what am I doing? How do I ever come back to that experience? And so you kind of crash, right? And that's pretty normal. It's actually pretty normal that after your mountaintop experience, you kind of crash. And 1 Kings 19 is one of my probably favorite stories, and this is why. Because in 1 Kings chapter 18, so the story before it, it's one of the most, I think probably one of the most well-known stories. I know as a kid I had a little book, and it had all these pictures, and it's kind of funny how they gloss over some of the darker sides to it. But in 1 Kings 18, the chapter before this, you have some really interesting history. The Jewish nation had been split in two, and you had a northern nation called Israel, and a southern nation that was called Judah. And all through the Kings and the Chronicles, it's very confusing because you kind of have two nations, right? With kings, king of the north, king of the south, king of Israel, king of Judah. That's what they're called, right? And the northern nation typically is kind of more messed up than the southern nation. The southern nation is where Jerusalem is. The southern nation lasts much longer. The northern nation faces the judgment of God, which is actually kind of where this text brings us. And so in the northern nation, God would have prophets, right? And these prophets would go and they would bring a word from God. And oftentimes the word from God was a combination of judgment, but also hope. They would say, look, you guys have really messed up. You haven't done what you were supposed to do. You didn't honor the covenant. Because of that, there are consequences. But then they would always end with hope, but God can show mercy and all of this, right? And that was Elijah's job. There was even like a school of the prophets, like a little seminary or something. We don't know exactly what it was like. But there was a whole group of prophets. And where it's interesting is that the king at the time is known as one of the most wicked kings that ever ruled over northern Israel, and that is King Ahab. And his wife, who is also very famous, most of you recognized her name probably, his wife was Queen Jezebel. So King Ahab and Queen Jezebel are the two that are ruling over the nation of Israel. And they are wicked, and they are evil, and they do not follow God, and they are leading the people into all sorts of idolatrous worship of other idols and other gods, Baal and others like that. And so in 1 Kings 18, you have what, like, I don't know, as a kid growing up, you're like, this is like the most awesome showdown in history. Because God sends a drought on on all of Israel. And the drought is just going on and on. And so Elijah, as the prophet of God, goes to Ahab and he says, look, we need to have some sort of a conflict, and we need to resolve this. And he says, I want you to get all your prophets, and I want you to go to the Mount Carmel, which Mount Carmel overlooks the Sea of Galilee. It's a beautiful area, and Valley of Armageddon and all that. But like Mount Carmel, he goes around the very mountaintop. I want you to build an altar and bring your prophets, and I want you to put whatever you want on that altar, and I want you to pray that your God will send fire and burn up the altar. And then I'll do it. And we'll see which God answers. So this is like a big deal. I mean, this is a big showdown. The king gets his prophets, Ahab and Jezebel get all their prophets together. It says all the people are gathered, and I don't know what that means, but a lot of people were gathered. And if you read this story, I mean, it's pretty funny actually. So the false prophets gather all the altar, and they put the animal on it, and they get it all together, and they start dancing, and they're chanting. It says they're cutting themselves, and they're doing things like this to call down fire from heaven, and nothing happens. And they do this for hours and hours and hours. And I love the humor in the Bible because Elijah starts to make fun of them. So Elijah says, oh, maybe you need to be a little louder. Maybe your God's sleeping. Is he taking a nap? Did he go for a long walk? He starts kind of making fun of them. And basically nothing happens. And so then Elijah says, all right, we're going to build my altar. And 3 times it says that he has them bring up jugs of water and dump it all over the altar. And there's a couple reasons. One is to show that there's no tricks. He doesn't have anything inside the altar that's going to turn it into flame, right? So there's no tricks, but also just to kind of like make it harder. And just to prove to everyone, like, this is really something from God. And then he gets down and he prays a simple prayer, and it says that fire shoots down from heaven, burns up the animals, literally burns up the rocks, and leaves nothing but a black scarred, spot on the ground, right? And Nancy, you're right. It is the first verses are confusing in chapter 19. Both people killed prophets. Okay, so Ahab was killing the prophets of God, but in this case, in chapter 18, all the people look around and say, "Whoa, these guys are false prophets." There's like no question, right? They're like, we just saw this with our own eyes, right? We just saw the God of Elisha, Yahweh, the true God. We just saw the true God burn up all this altar. And all you false prophets are a bunch of liars. You've been misleading us for all these years. And so Elijah says, take them down and kill them at the river. And they do. They literally, a little different time. They take them down and they kill all the false prophets too. So in chapter 19, imagine if you're this prophet Elijah and you get to the top of this mountain, you have this massive showdown where you're trusting that God is going to do something amazing because God has told you to do this. And you pray and God sends on fire. This is like, you talk about a mountaintop experience, a little better than my event, right? Like, this is pretty awesome. So Elijah literally has a mountaintop experience. The very next story, okay, he kills all these false prophets. All this is good. The very next story is Elijah, or is 1 Kings chapter 19. And basically, Ahab, in verse 1, it says, Ahab told Jezebel everything Elijah had done. She hadn't been there. Ahab was there. She had stayed home. She had things to do. So he says, look, Elijah did this. He killed all these prophets. So he sends a message, or Jezebel sends a message to Elijah and basically says, if by tomorrow morning you aren't just like those prophets you killed, I'm a liar, right? Like I'm the king and the queen, and I'm coming after you. So imagine this in our day. This would be, this would be like, and we don't have kings and queens necessarily, but this would be like if the president of the United States sends you a personal message from the Secret Service and he says, I'm rolling out the National Guard and the Armed Forces and the Marines, Navy SEALs, and everybody, and I'm coming for you. And by tomorrow morning, you're dead. This is not like a light thing. This is the military, right? Like the Israeli military, he says, they're coming for you. These guys are going to get on their chariots. These guys are trained soldiers. They're going to find you. They're going to kill you. That's it. So Elijah goes from this awesome mountaintop experience to the next morning getting this note from Jezebel that says, you're dead. Like, you're not going to make it. And Elijah responds with great courage and bravery. And he grabs his robe and he runs. That was sarcasm. So he runs. He really does. He just runs. Think about this. You just watched God call fire down And he doesn't say, my God will protect me, my God will take care of me. He doesn't say that. He runs. He is scared to death. And honestly, I can understand, right? So he is scared to death. So he goes from this mountaintop experience to basically running for his life, right? And it says that he runs. He was afraid. He ran for his life. And he comes to Beersheba in Judah. Now remember Elijah's the prophet of Israel. He's now in Beersheba in Judah. He is this is many, many miles. Okay? So he's now in the southern kingdom. Okay? He has moved from Israel to the southern kingdom. This wasn't just like he ran across the street. He took off and ran. So we don't know how long it took him. But he ran, and it says he finally goes out and then from the town of Beersheba, he goes off into the wilderness. He just heads out into the desert. And he says, I'm just out of here, going into the wilderness. And he finds this bush, and he lies down, and he's literally just exhausted, and he's been running, and he's just done. He has no more energy. God has deserted him, as far as he's concerned. He's just running for his life, and he has this moment. The title of my sermon is When All Is Lost, because he has this moment where he, in his opinion, all is lost. Okay? And he says, I have had enough, Lord. And he's literally suicidal. He says, take my life. It would be better for me to be dead. Now, in church, we're not supposed to talk about these things because we're just supposed to pretend like we're happy all the time. But that is not real life. And there are moments where I hope you can relate to this, because there are moments in our lives where it does feel like all is lost. Where it sometimes, I hope you're not suicidal, but he is very, very, probably anxious, probably anxiety because anxiety is rooted in fear. It's a fear. He is scared to death, literally scared to death. He is probably depressed. He is despondent. I might as well just be dead. What's the point? Take my life. And so God responds, and that's what I want to talk about. When we have lost all hope, God responds in some really interesting ways, and I want to highlight how God responds to his servant who is despondent, who probably in a perfect world should be faithfully standing up against the king and the queen. But he's not. He's human. And he's messed up and he's frail, and he is literally in despair. And I want you to notice how God responds. God does a couple of things. The first thing is that God responds, I'm just going to say it this way, God responds with love. I don't know if you noticed the first thing that happens when he is just collapsing with this tree. It says, all at once, an angel, which angel just means God's messenger, right? An angel touched him and said, how dare you, right? No, he says, get up and eat. And he looks around, and there by his head was some baked bread over hot coals and a jar of water. And he ate and he drank, and he laid down again. And then the angel of the Lord comes back a second time, touches him to wake him up, and says, get up and eat. This journey is too much for you. I love that moment. Because that is not how I would have responded to Elijah if I were God. It's not how I respond to my children. It's not how I respond to other people. That is not my gut reaction. Elijah has basically seen this amazing act of God, and then his life is threatened, and he throws his hands up in the air and says, just kill me now. And God comes to him and says, you're tired and you're hungry. Why don't you have a meal and take a nap? That's how God responds. God responds with love. And what I really love about this is that it reminds us that we are not just, I think too often in the church, we just think of ourselves as we like to think of ourselves as spiritual beings, and we forget that we are whole beings. We are embodied. The things that are happening to our bodies impact our minds, impact our spirit, all of it. I tell my kids this sometimes. Sometimes the most spiritual thing my teenager can do is to go take a nap before they say anything else. Sometimes the most spiritual thing I can do is grab a granola bar out of the pantry because I'm hangry and I'm about to say something stupid. And I don't need to read my Bible or pray, although that's all good. But like sometimes I just need to realize, wait, I'm tired. It's, whatever, 11 o'clock at night, and my teenager wants to have a conversation, and now is not the time. I need to sleep, or they need to sleep, or whatever, right? Like, and sometimes you can't do that, you have to have a conversation. But, we are embodied people. And I love that God does not wake up Elijah and say, we need to talk about your theology. Who do you think I am? He doesn't get into all that because Elijah's tired and hungry. And he says, you are exhausted, have a meal. Let's have another meal, right? Like, you're really hungry. Take a nap, go to sleep, rest up. We'll talk in a minute. And I just love that picture. When Jesus calls God Father in the New Testament, in the Gospels, the word he uses is one of the softest words for father. Some say that you could actually translate it as daddy or dad. This is the dad that Jesus knew. The one who said, have a nap, have some food, and let's talk in a minute. You're not doing great, but that's okay. We're going to talk. So the angel shows up, and he does all this, and then he says, okay, let's move on. So he gets up and eats, and strengthened by the food, it says he travels 40 days and 40 nights. I don't know if that's literal or not, okay? I don't know if actually Elijah traveled for 40 days and 40 nights on a couple of meals. If it did, it was a miracle, and that's awesome. If he didn't, I don't know, but there's a lot of symbolism there. 40 days and 40 nights, you may recognize that. That's the wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. That's Moses going back from Egypt into the wilderness to be a shepherd for 40 years. 40 is an important number. Jesus goes out into the wilderness, and does it for 40 days and 40 nights, right? Like, this is some symbolism here. And 40 days in the wilderness is kind of a thing for the Israelite people. So he goes into the wilderness for 40 days for a long time. And he goes out, and he comes to a cave, and it's near water, and that's important because it's the Middle East. This is desert. Water's a big deal. So this is a place, God brings him to a place that is safe. He brings him to a place where he can just be himself, and where he doesn't have to worry about anyone else. And God takes him to this, he feeds him, he lets him sleep, and then he brings him to a safe place. And God says, okay, now we're going to talk. Okay? So first, God responds with love. And second, God responds with his presence. And this is just so fascinating to me. Sometimes I think we miss the details. It says that the word of the Lord came to him, and he asks him a question, and I love that. Jesus does that all through the Gospels. Jesus is far less likely to give you a statement. He's much more likely to ask you a question. And it would be a very pointed question. God asked Elijah, what are you doing here? As if he doesn't know, as if he's not sure what's going on, as if he hasn't fed him and led him to this cave, right? Let's let Elijah talk, right? Some advice for us, we could follow in God's footsteps sometimes. Most people don't need a lecture. Most people need to be asked questions. What are you doing here? And Elijah gives a response, and his response is interesting. He says, I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. I have worked really hard. I have done what I was supposed to do. The Israelites have rejected your covenant. And he's not wrong in any of this, right? They have torn down your altars, and they have put your prophets to death with a sword. He had also put prophets to death with a sword earlier, which is why it's a little confusing. Both people were doing things like that. So, but Ahab and Jezebel were killing God's prophets. And he says something that's interesting. He says, I am the only one left. And now they are trying to kill me too. It's almost humorous in the despair, but I think we can relate to this, right? We've been in places like that. I don't know about you, I have been in moments where, when my wife's talking to me, she's just like, I give up. Like, you act as if the end of the world is here. And I'm like, yes, it is. And then the next morning after I've had a good night's sleep, I'm like, that's okay. Give me my cup of coffee, I'm fine. And it's like, we're like that sometimes, right? We're a lot like Elijah. And so Elijah basically says, this is terrible, everything's awful. I've had a very good, terrible, no good, very bad day. And the Lord says, go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord. For the Lord is about to pass by. And this is also something that happens a lot. We see this with Moses. Moses went up away from the people, and it said the presence of the Lord would pass by. There's a lot of symbolism here. And then he does something that actually is very reminiscent of Moses and the founding of the nation. He says, a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart, shattered the rocks, but the Lord was not in the wind. And then after the wind, there's an earthquake. The Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came fire. The Lord was not in the fire. Now, what are all those things? Those aren't random. All of those things are the things that God has done in the past. Multiple times, God is being praised in the Old Testament for showing up in the wind and the thunder and the fire and the earthquakes. This would be the expectation. This is how God shows up. Frankly, this is how he just did show up, right? Elijah prayed and the fire came down from heaven. God showed up in the fire. This is how God typically has worked. David praises God in 2 Samuel 22, and he talks about all the same elements. In Psalm 18, we see it again. All the same elements. Exodus 19, where Moses comes down off the mountain, it says that the rock shook, and it's all the same elements. This is how God works for the nation of Israel. So it is totally normal for Elijah to say, this is where God is. And yet God shows up and does something different. He says, nope, not here, not here, not here. Because he's teaching Elijah a lesson. And it says, after the fire came a gentle whisper. Some translations say still small voice. It's the idea of kind of like it's kind of like a word on the wind kind of idea. Gentle whisper is not a bad way to say it. And this is fascinating. Elijah, as God's prophet, recognizes the presence of God. And it says when Elijah heard it, not everything else, but he heard the whisper, he pulled his cloak over his face, he went out, and he stood at the mouth of the cave. So Elijah knows God is there. And then God talks to him again, and he asks him the same question. He doesn't give a statement. He says, what are you doing here, Elijah? And what I love about the second answer is he says the exact same thing. Elijah has not changed his mind. Elijah is still having a very bad day. And Elijah says, I've done all this stuff, and and I'm all by myself, and I might as well die. I mean, he says the exact same thing, all right? And so I love Elijah because he's just like us. He's just as hard-headed as us and just as stubborn as us. So what does God do when we've lost hope, when all is lost? He shows up with love, and he shows up with his presence. And I want to point this out because I think we misunderstand this sometimes. This isn't about telling us that as God's people we should be walking around always listening for that gentle whisper or always trying to hear God's voice. And none of those things are wrong, but that's not actually the point. What God is telling Elijah is he's telling him a couple of things because of Elijah's history and Israel's history. What he's saying is, I'm not going to always show up in the same way. Just because I've shown up in the wind and the earthquake and the fire doesn't mean that I can't do other things. Stop thinking in the box, Elijah. Stop putting me in a box. Stop saying you have to do this or else you're not here. Because that's what he's saying. Elijah's looking around and saying, God, why, you're not showing up. And God says, no, I don't have to show up the way you want me to. I can show up in other ways. And he also says something else. He says, he's reminding Elijah, I am in the things that you cannot see and you cannot understand. You can see fire, you can feel the earthquake, but a gentle whisper on the wind, grab that. You can't. So what he's telling Elijah is, look, I am working, I am active, I am doing things. Most of it you can't see. And that requires faith. And that's the hard part, right? But that's what he's reminding Elijah of. He says, hey, I'm doing stuff, you just don't see it. And then he's finally reminding him at the end, I am actually with you, no matter what. You may not see great dramatic stuff every day. You may not have that Mount Carmel mountaintop experience every day. That's all right. I'm still here. I'm still with you. So God responds to this despair with love, and he responds with his presence. And then the last one is actually, I think, maybe the most interesting. God also responds with a patient response that involves mercy, grace, and justice. because he comes back to Elijah. He asks him a second time, what are you doing here? And Elijah replies, I've been zealous. Basically, nothing's changed. And just think about this in verse 15. So at this point, if I'm the parent and my kids are telling me these things, I'm starting to get irritated, right? Like we've had a meal, you had a nap, right? Like I've sat with you, I've listened to you, I'm my presence with you, I'm loving you, I'm present with you. At this point, I'm starting to get to the end of my patience. And at this point, if I'm the parent, I'm like, okay, buddy, listen up, right? And yet still God doesn't respond that way. Still God is patient with Elijah. Because Elijah responds and God says to him, no rebuke. Actually, there's no rebuke anywhere in here until the very end, and I think it's a little bit of a smirk, sarcasm from God, rebuke. It's kind of humorous. And the Lord says to him, you know what, go back the way you came. Go to the desert of Damascus. So the desert of Damascus would be north. He says, go back. He says, you know what, we're good. He doesn't give him a big lecture about it. He doesn't say, you know what, you got to change your mind, Elijah. What's wrong with you? He says, you know what, I have some things I want you to do. Why don't you head back? I'm not going to change your mind by giving you a lecture. Head back and go to Damascus. And he gives him 3 things to do. And we miss, I think, sometimes what these are. He says, I want you to anoint 3 people. Hazael, king of Aram. Jehu, king of northern Israel, basically. And Elisha to take over your place. For you, to succeed you. Now those 3 things are important because remember that the nation of Israel is in a wicked place, and ultimately there's great injustice being done. And what God says is, you know what? There's mercy and there's grace, but there's also justice. And what he says is that the nation of Israel needs to face judgment. They need to face justice. And he said, and you're feeling this, right? Like think about Elijah. Elijah's standing here, and this king and this queen want to kill him for following God. This is unjust. This is not righteous. And he's feeling that tension, and he's like, I don't understand this. And God gives him 3 things to do, and Elijah will not see this play out. Elijah will not see this in his lifetime. But God gives him 3 tasks that ultimately set up final justice. And I want to tell that story. King Hazael, interesting story. Hazael's not a king. Hazael's not even an Israelite. He sends Elijah to go find Hazael, who's in the kingdom north of Israel, which would have been the Aramaic, Syrian, Damascus is the capital of Syria. He sends him up north to a foreign kingdom, and he says, I want you to tell Hazael. Hazael is like, not second in command, but he's basically a high-up guy under the king. He's not the king. And you can go look up the story, but basically he anoints Hazael and says, you're going to be the king. And ultimately, Hazael's not a good man. He's not an Israelite. He's not following God. He goes back up, he kills the king to become the king, and later, years later, not right away, years later, King Hazael attacks northern Israel. And God says, I'm going to have Hazael use the sword to bring justice. Eventually, the northern Israelites are going to face justice from the king of Assyria. But, by the way, Hazael's not going to get everybody. So I want you to appoint Jehu, who is also not a king right now, and anoint him and say, hey, you're going to be the king over northern Israel. And what happens in the future is Jehu teams up with Hazael, and together they basically enact justice. And Jehu is the king who, when Jezebel is thrown out the window, he drives his chariot over her body. So Jezebel, I know, fun stories, right? Jezebel, who is threatening Elijah's life, one day is going to die at the hands of Jehu. But Elijah will not see any of this. He will not live to see it. And then he says one other thing. He says, go appoint Elisha. Because Elisha's going to take over your mantle. He's going to be your next prophet of Israel. It's not, and in essence, it's an act of grace. It's not all on you, Elijah. It isn't all on you. And then the final statement where I think God has a little bit of a smirk, he says, because remember, twice now Elijah has said, I am the only one left. God says, oh, kind of by the way, there are at least 7,000 people who have not bowed the knee to Baal. Just FYI. And he just kind of leaves it for Elijah. And I think God just kind of smiles about that. You're not alone, Elijah. I know you think you are, but you're not. And that's about the closest God gets to a rebuke. right here. And I just find it so amazing, because we usually view the God of the Old Testament as a vindictive, wrathful God. But the truth is, he's a God of justice, mercy, grace, patience. Elijah will not see any of this justice come to pass. He's actually taken up in a chariot. That's how the story goes. He never actually sees it. Elisha will see it. Elijah will never be fully vindicated while he's alive. He's being asked to trust this God. Tom mentioned, I think it was Tom mentioned praying for peace. I don't know who mentioned that today. I know in our modern day, I don't know about you guys, but I feel like we have information overload right now. We are bombarded. I pull out my smartphone and I am bombarded with news, and it's not good most of the time. Because good news doesn't, I don't know if you know this, but they did studies on social sciences, and if you hear good news, you will tell 1 to 3 people. If you hear bad news, you will tell 7. It is human nature. So when you turn on the news, just know that 70% of it's going to be bad news. And we are bombarded with news: mass shootings, suicide bombings, unjust wars across the globe. I hear of rockets being fired across borders, children's soccer teams being hit, even threats of nuclear war. If we look closer, I see illness and disease that just racks people's bodies. That can be really bad. Anger and hatred in our political discourse. Racism and bigotry is still alive and well. And all sorts of people doing all sorts of evil. And frankly, it can be easy to relate to Elijah and to respond the same way. It can be easy to say, I am overwhelmed with anxiety, depression, even despair. And so I guess I just want to put it out there that when you are feeling that way, I want you to open up your Bible, or at least think about this story. And think about a man who felt the same way in 1 Kings 19. And I want you to think about his God. Because his God is your God. And when you are feeling total despair, God comes to you with love, and he comes to you with his presence, and he comes to you patiently reminding you that mercy and grace and justice will come. It may not come in your lifetime, but one day it will come. And I just love this story, because I turn to it over and over and over again in my own life when I'm in these low moments. And I think, I'm so thankful that the Bible is real, and that these people have real feelings. And it doesn't just gloss it over and say, everybody's happy all the time. Because that's not life, and that's not how this works. But I am also thankful that it tells us that God is with us, and that he loves us, and that he cares for us, and that he's not waiting to slap me when I mess up. He's there to care for me, and to give me a meal, and to remind me to go take a nap.